by the time that I am now editing this. Happy 2023, y'all, and welcome back to the Volunteer State Rails. We were up here fairly recently, actually, to Railfan Norfolk Southern's C&O and TP Main, if you recall. And now for Christmas break, we're back in Tennessee to Railfan on the former L&N CSX's KD Subdivision, a particular stretch of CSX trackage that stretches between Corbin, Kentucky and Etowah, Tennessee. A few notable points about this subdivision are the original signals that still govern trains over it, the Appalachian Mountain region, and downtown Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where home base for this trip would be for us. After visiting some Tennessean family for the holidays, we'd make our way down to Knoxville to check into our Fairfield Inn. Once that was done, it was the mid-afternoon by now, and we would head down to CSX's Willoughby interlocking. Because another perhaps not so notable point about the KD subdivision is that it is not very busy. Only 2 daily mixed freight trains run this subdivision a day, and beyond that there actually are quite a few trains that run this subdivision, but they are all as needed unit trains, so they are very unpredictable and can run whatever day and whatever time they want. So a lot of days out here would be kind of hit and miss. That's why I chose to go to Willoughby first, because I knew that here we could get either CSX or Norfolk Southern trains. Willoughby interlocking is where the Norfolk Southern's Knoxville West End district crosses the KD subdivision at grade, and this will be a pretty common spot for us over this trip, so get used to it. And at least from the start of things, it would appear that I had made the right decision, because within 10 minutes of pulling up to the Diamond, a Norfolk Southern mixed freight came out of the west. To be frank, because Norfolk Southern has had some train symbol changes fairly recently, and I'm not familiar with any of their symbols over this West End district, I'm not going to be including any of the Norfolk Southern symbols in this video, especially since we were up here to focus on the CSX tracks rather than the Norfolk Southern ones. But if any of you watching would like to identify these trains as you watch the video, feel free to comment a timestamp and the train symbols in the comments section, and I may or may not pin that comment because I'm sure myself and others would appreciate that information. When the mixed freight's rear locomotive clears, it reveals a westbound intermodal sitting in a siding just east of the Diamond. We had actually seen this train sitting there on our way here, which is what really prompted us to come to Willoughby first. But what we hadn't realized was that he was waiting on that eastbound mixed freight. So once that mixed freight was out of their way, the switches would be lined and the intermodal would take off westbound. We were kind of playing an unspoken game of chicken with a couple of things today. A, the trains, B, the forecast. Obviously, we're in unfamiliar territory with uncertain amounts of rail traffic, but the forecast was calling for a light dusting of snow in Knoxville. Considering how inconsistent the forecast had just been with this sort of thing over in Crossville, we were quite skeptical, but we knew for a fact that if there was any day on this trip we were going to get snow, it would be today. And with nothing else to do and a friend still on the way, Willoughby is where we'd spend the rest of the day, and we would just see what happened.
Yeah, 5 minutes after the introduction update. This was like the whole theme of our trip to Altoona last year. And some Siberian cold front is providing some snow in Knoxville this Christmas. Alright, update as of roughly 4 p.m. We got some accumulation. Still no more trains, but snow's still slowly falling. And it's sticking. And look who decided to show up. What are you doing here? What are you doing here?
I don't know. Attack you.
That's the wrong state, bruh.
I'm gonna go attack. Oh my god.
That's the wrong state.
I'm kind of wearing the wrong jacket for here.
Alright, update number 3 at 4:16 p.m. is really coming down now. Yeah, welcome back to Altoona, Pennsylvania, in Knoxville, Tennessee. I mean, check it out. It is really falling. We did not expect this. No trains still, but... Oh, yeah, but he's covered up the wrong state hoodie. Hey, you can't cover up the hoodie and be in the right state now. Everybody knows you messed up. This is what we work all year to do. This is what we work all year to do. It's got a tad of a comforting hold on us.
Yeah,
First day trackside for what? Couple hours, and this is what we got? I will say though, this is the only day of the trip that we had a chance to get this, so we're gonna enjoy this now. Good choice in Knoxville. Andrew.
What?
What is wrong with you? And now my mom's filming me.
And in fact, the snow would continue to fall for hours and hours. So much so that when we had still seen no trains by the time night had fallen, we had to call it quits that day and head back to the hotel. Because if we didn't, the roads would get icy and we wouldn't be able to make it back. Because eventually the snow would lighten but show no signs of stopping. So, even though no more trains would yield for day 1, we made the decision to abandon post and start fresh with snow on the ground tomorrow morning. The next morning, we would all awaken to a winter wonderland. White powdery snow covering just about everything the eye could see. Now, the morning of December 27th, the snow had finally subsided and we were headed back to Willoughby on word of an M541 nearing Knoxville coming out of the Appalachians. Arriving back at Willoughby, the first thing that Andrew and I did was check on a suspicion that I had from the night before. Looking at the Norfolk Southern tracks, we can see that the rails have no snow on top of them, which is evidence of a train having ran the night before because no trains had run since the snowfall had started yesterday afternoon. We had figured that there would likely be train traffic on the Norfolk Southern overnight, but the CSX I was not so sure of, and had a suspicion that the next morning there may still be snow on top of those rails. And moving over to the CSX line, I would sure as hell be right. Not one train had used this track since the snow had started yesterday afternoon. That just goes to show you how infrequent trains can be on the KD subdivision. But we knew that that pattern was soon to be broken this morning as a southbound M541 was nearing Knoxville with a medium approach signal on the Willoughby interlocking.
Willoughby, 5 for 1 side.
M541 is a daily running mixed freight train from Cincinnati, Ohio to Waycross, Georgia. Along the way, they'll stop and work the yards at Knoxville, Tennessee, where we are, Etowah, Tennessee, Cartersville, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, before terminating in Waycross. This train and its northbound counterpart M542 are the 2 daily trains that run the KD subdivision. Everything else that is set to run this line is either coal, ethanol, or some other special commodity train that only runs on an as-needed basis. And even these daily running mixed freights can be a hit or miss, because even though they run each day, the KD subdivision is quite a ways into both of their routes. And as a result, even if they both left their originating terminals at the same time every day, there's quite a bit of room for error along the way here. Such often results in both of these trains running the KD subdivision at very different times every day. So, long story short, the KD subdivision is basically you get what you get when you get it and you're happy about it. That said, we were pretty happy to see this M541 this morning crossing the diamond for 2 hours. Yeah, 2 hours they'd cross the diamond for because they'd stop on the diamond to switch Knoxville Yard. Their train was so long that it couldn't fit in the limits of Knoxville Yard. By the time they had reached the south end, they still had about 500 feet of train hanging out across the diamond. The double track that splits out of the single main here at Willoughby for Knoxville Yard is only about 7,500 feet long. And so that said, it's fairly safe to assume this train was likely around 8,000 or maybe 8,500 feet. So all we could do was sit around and stare at his covered hopper cars until a couple hours went by and they rumbled to life again. Inching their way across the diamond, 541 would be done with their work at Knoxville and were headed south for Etowah. They'd stop in Etowah to get a new crew before taking it further south for Atlanta and Waycross. We didn't really know what else to do afterwards for a while, until the radio started giving us some odd clues at something coming south, followed by the switch at the double track here at Willoughby, switching to track 1. We didn't really know what this meant until the headlight of a locomotive under the same heritage as this rail line rounded the corner from the north, right behind the 541.
686 dispatch to Jackson, W1523 over. W1523 over. Updated milepost over.
Switching off the single main to track 1 to bypass Knoxville Yard was a southbound WO1523, a southbound work train loaded with strips of continuous welded rail. From an unknown origin somewhere in Kentucky, this guy was bound south for Climax, Georgia. And from their unspecified origin, the KD subdivision was the prime route for this train to take south. And 2 EMD SD40-2s with L&N Heritage, the same builders of this rail line, would be pulling this train to Climax. The train came and went fairly quickly. These rail trains are only about 2,500 feet in length, and so they don't take very long to pass. But what we realized was that with how unpredictable the KD subdivision is and what a gem this train was with its EMD power and welded rail consist, was that this would be a prime train to chase southbound on the KD sub to Etowah, or at least down that way. With this possible to be the only train that we'd see around here for hours and how much of a novelty it was almost a given that we should chase this thing. And their periodic stop in Knoxville allowed us to get out of town in front of the train and set up in the suburbs just south of Knoxville. I'm pretty sure that we're still considered to be in southern Knoxville here, but we're just north of CSX's Singleton siding. And within 15 minutes of our arrival, WO15's dual EMD motors could be heard, almost unrealistically, cranked to the top, blasting off from Knoxville. The backstreet roads and houses, still covered in the previous night's fresh snow, paired with this train, would make for what I'd consider my favorite shot of this whole trip.
Singleton CSX engine 8037, southbound, WO1523 up. And south end, Singleton, CSX engine 8037, southbound, WO1523 up.
CSX Equipment Defect Detector, milepost 321.5. No defects. No defects. Total axle 156. End of transmission.
Southbound along Highway 411, we'd be following WO15 southward, though we wouldn't be able to see him until Englewood, Tennessee. That was where we had planned to go next, and since the road kind of veers away from the tracks for most of the journey there, we wouldn't be able to see him again. We'd hear the work train trip 2 or 3 defect detectors along the way. No issues were found, so we were southbound for Englewood, Tennessee. Englewood is just a fairly small community along Highway 411 about 7.5 miles north of Etowah. Though we're here for CSX's Englewood siding, which still has its original L&N installed USNS color light signals guarding each end. Though the south end is fairly inaccessible, at the north end the city has a nice recreational area set up with a few coffee shops. Some signal maintainers would also be present at the north end, performing some electrical work within the trackside relay cases and also inspecting the north switch. Though their work didn't seem to heed our WO15 coming south, as they still had a high green, full speed ahead signal indication at the north end of Englewood. And although it definitely would not be full speed ahead likely for this track work, we would see the work train's pair of family-owned SD40-2s passing the originally installed L&N color lights. Here at Englewood Avenue would be our final catch of WO15 as they roll south towards Etowah, and the slower speed did give us a chance to really observe the multiple 2,200 foot long strips of continuous welded rail that this train was carrying. Though as you can also see, now that we're way down south in Englewood, most of the snow on the ground is gone. The snow that we had received in Knoxville the night before had reportedly broken many yearly records for this part of Tennessee. After we had gotten the first bit of heavy snow in the beginning, the snow would continue almost all the way through the night as a light dusting. Ultimately though, dropping almost 3 or 4 inches of snow in one night. But as one could expect, the further south you go, the less snow you're going to see, as the temperatures get warmer and the sun is out for longer. So unfortunately, we had to see most of the snow fade away as we drove south to Englewood, and as we drive further south later on in the day. Though after the WO15 cleared us at Englewood, it was about time for us to find a bite to eat. Englewood definitely ain't one of the biggest towns around here, so our options were fairly limited. We weren't really sure what to do until I looked across the street and found the Tellico Junction Cafe. Since it was literally right across the street and these railroad-themed cafes have had a tendency to perform very well, I said, you know what, let's give it a try. Perhaps one of the best decisions that we made that day. After the months it's been since we've been there, what exactly I ordered that day has slipped my mind, but I do remember leaving there thinking that was a damn good lunch. For whatever reason you might be around this area to catch trains or for some other reason, definitely give the Tellico Junction Cafe a visit if you have the time or the means to do so. It has a very relaxing southern atmosphere with fantastic food and service. After we had filled up on food, our attention was back at the tracks. The tracks, which, once again, often don't have trains running on them. So we made the decision to, since nothing was running that we knew of and we were already this far south, to make the final miles of driving down to Etowah, Tennessee. Etowah, similar to Englewood, is kind of just one of those built-up communities along Highway 411 that you kind of pass through along your way. And although it's only a mere shell of what it used to be, CSX has its Etowah rail yard here, as well as a historic L&N Depot museum. That museum, I believe, is also the origination point for passengers on the Hiwassee River Rail adventure. Andrew and I had recently heard of an M542 coming north, reaching the Georgia and Tennessee state lines. Being the northbound sister to the M541 that we saw at Knoxville this morning, 542 would be northbound from Waycross, Georgia, bound for Cincinnati, Ohio. Knowing that he'd have to stop and work the yard at Etowah, we moved just south of it to the overpass at East Etowah Road. And the only snow that we'd be seeing at this spot was the little bit that hadn't yet melted due to the shadows cast by the bridge barriers.
M542 will add you over. Yeah, coming through the south end.
And fairly shortly, 542's dual GE motors would appear from around the corner, approaching Etowah Yard.
5 cars, CSX 491, alt 49. 491049. We'll come off in 25. We'll put them in the 10 track. And you got 14 of them to pick up in the 11 track. We'll have to talk to 203. He's got a car in that 10 track right now. He's got to dig out. He's trying to get it out of your way right now.
All right, setting those off in 10 and picking up 14 out of 11.
Yes, sir, that's right. And like I said, there's one of them. There's one car in 10, but Kenny's on his way over right now to get it.
All right, sounds good.
That there was the conversation between 542 and the yardmaster about what cars would have to be dropped off and picked up at the yard. A fairly odd aspect about Etowah is this track 2 that 542 is coming in on to the yard. It actually curves away from track 1 that continues straight into the yard and reconnects with it further up the line about 1,000 feet. The likely reason for bringing this 542 up the number 2 track was because the number 1 track was occupied by our M541 from this morning at Knoxville. They were still sitting in Etowah because they had stopped here for a recrew, but no crew had yet arrived. So until another crew was available to take the train further, they'd be stranded at Etowah. So 542 would kind of have to work around them this evening, and 542 would certainly have the interesting consist this evening. Some loaded Tropicana refrigerated boxcars, those that I'm familiar with from my home territory, this limited amount of cars headed for Tropicana's distribution plant in Cincinnati. And following a mid-train distributed power locomotive, ES44AH number 751, the loads that really caught our eye were this long string of flat cars loaded with pipes. It's evident that some city up north is having major renovations because there were a good 20 to 30 flat cars strapped down tight with these pipes on 542.
Yes, sir, that's right. And like I said, there's one of them. There's one car in 10, but Kenny's on his way over right now to get it.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, sir. They got to take the junk called. I done forgot. I think it's like 1646. I'm sure it's right on somebody's darn rail.
All right. RNY. Oh, we're right at in, good job, Ribbon does, so I guess we're heading north there on signal indication, AC.
Yeah, come on north, signal indication, thanks, AC dispatch round.
M542 out.
About an hour and a half later, M542 calls the AC dispatcher asking for permission to leave Etowah and head north for the next crew change point at Corbin, Kentucky. So, with our final twilights of daylight left in the sky, M542 takes off from Etowah, Tennessee. At which, by the way, the KD subdivision comes to an end. So, this signal visible in the foreground is the southernmost, southward absolute searchlight signal on the KD subdivision. Beyond Etowah Yard to the south, the subdivision changes and all the signals go back to the modern safe train aluminum masts. But regarding M542, it was the only train looking to be running around this area at this time, and M541 sitting in the yard did not show any signs of getting another crew soon. And since the sun was going down and we'd have to get back to Knoxville at some point tonight, we decided to follow the M542, and I say follow loosely, because we weren't really chasing this thing, but we were headed back to Knoxville as they were too. Though we very quickly realized that even though we hadn't intended to anyway, we wouldn't be beating this train anywhere. We could all but match this train's speed as we sped back up Highway 411 for Knoxville, and the lights were getting dimmer and dimmer in the sky. Although I didn't film this part, even coming into the outskirts of Knoxville, we were still neck and neck with this train, having gained no distance on it whatsoever. Though we did know that they'd have to stop and also work the yard at Knoxville. So, where did we go? Who would have thought? We went right back to Willoughby. And that decision would actually go to shed some light on our seemingly dire situation. As M542 began to work the yard tracks at Knoxville just to our south, Norfolk Southern would have some trains to run over its West End district, with one of them coming up out of the west within 30 minutes of our arrival. eastbound train of manifest freight and intermodal containers. Some conversation over the radio that I overheard before we had arrived that included this train's lead engine number alluded to the idea that this was some sort of local switching job. And I do know that Norfolk Southern has some sort of intermodal facility just east of here, but even so, the length of this train paired with the 3 road engines for power, with 2 at the front and this one in the middle, makes me want to think otherwise. It would be in cases such as this that those of you watching who are familiar with Norfolk Southern symbols in this area could come in very handy down in the comment section. But what was very loud and clear through that radio conversation was that there was another mixed train following this one eastbound. So, not long after this mystery train clears Willoughby, here comes mystery number 2. By now, another hour had gone by, and it was time for the final contender of the night. M542, finished with their work at Knoxville Yard, now headed northbound through Willoughby, bound for their next crew change point in Corbin, Kentucky. Midway through this train's passing, my camera would finally run out of battery and stop recording prematurely. But either way, 542 was going to end our day after he cleared Willoughby. So I took a mental video of the rest of the train with my own 2 eyes and called it a day. That would be, of course, until tomorrow. Good afternoon from December 28th. As a result of us not hearing about much running this day, we wouldn't make it trackside until the early afternoon, at which point we finally turned the wheel to the north. The KD sub south of Knoxville is cool and all, but most of the historic and neat scenes are all to the north. And so with this first train we heard about coming southbound, that's where we turn today, taking the combination of Interstate 75 and side streets to LaFollette, Tennessee. More specifically, the Nevada Avenue Road crossing. Realistically, we're a few track miles to the north of LaFollette. I had found this spot while searching on maps beforehand, so I figured we'd give this one a shot. Pun fully intended. We are just south of the very curvy and low-speed section of the KD sub that winds through the heart of the Appalachian Mountain region. We were hoping to make it up to that part of the line this day, but with no other trains, spoiler I'll say, that won't be this day. Because our train was southbound, and after having started their journey very early this morning out of Cincinnati with a new crew from Corbin, southbound comes daily M541, Cincinnati to Waycross mixed freight daily. I am kind of skipping over 541 here because he was pretty short, and this won't be the last time that we see him today. And the best part about it is that when we see him again, he'll be even shorter. Daredevils, that I guess we were. Following the 541 southbound from LaFollette, knowing very well that there were no other trains around to see. If you look at all this on a map, you'll see pretty quickly that the primary road route from where we are in LaFollette down towards Knoxville is via Interstate 75. That's the road we took to get here, but if you know where the KD Subdivision is, you'll know that it curves very far out to the west away from I-75 between Rocky Top and Knoxville. So to try to follow 541 out to where we wanted to see it next meant exiting 75 at Rocky Top and taking the Lake City Highway down towards Clinton and ultimately some other backcountry roads out to Belated, Tennessee where we wanted to see it next. And the railroad tracks that we'd parallel for a lot of the way out there were actually not the KD Subdivision but rather the Norfolk Southern's K&O extension. If you've watched any of my videos from this past summer of Railfanning Norfolk Southern's C&O and TP line, you'll recall that the K&O extension is the line that branches out in a Y at Harriman, Tennessee and runs out towards Knoxville. Such will also have you recall that only 2 daily intermodal trains run this line every day. But now on this line with a new mission, we'd follow it into Belated, Tennessee, where CSX's KD Subdivision passes under the K&O extension. It is at this underpass where more original searchlight signals remain, such as what made it a point of interest for this M541 coming south. We wanted to see it passing these original signals, but such wouldn't be so. We'd find out later that we missed the 541 here by about 5.5 minutes. With absolutely nothing else around, we'd have no chance of seeing anything past these signals today, but we weren't going to leave empty-handed, so we took plenty of pictures of the searchlight signals before leaving. But while we're here, I'd like to share something interesting that I learned about Belated. Those of you that watched my C&O and TP videos from this past summer will recall the Kingston power plant that Norfolk Southern runs coal trains to off the BNSF and its own systems. That Kingston power plant would occasionally receive the occasional coal train from CSX. Right here at Belated, there's a Y that breaks out of the KD Subdivision and runs east on a spur to a chemical customer, but also connects to Norfolk Southern's K&O extension further to the east as well. Apparently, every now and then, CSX would run a coal train from here on that connection out east to Norfolk Southern's Kingston power plant. If anybody watching knows more about this past operation, please let me know in the comments section because I am really interested to hear more about it. Though according to area rail fan Jackson Perkle, this hasn't happened since 2017. Calling it quits at Belated, we'd head into Clinton for lunch before heading west for Interstate 75 via Edgemore Road, on which we'd pass by the Tennessee Valley Authority's Bull Run steam power plant. Right off the banks of the Melton Hill Lake, the railroad refers to this place as Edgemore, and it receives the occasional coal train from CSX off the KD Sub. But we'll revisit the Bull Run power plant in a couple days, so we won't focus on this for now. Because over our lunch in Clinton, we came to the realization that there were no trains running in our area. And after hearing where the only trains were to see this day, we turned the wheel straight south on 75, destination, Etowah, Tennessee. Yeah, at this point in the day, we were going to make the hour-and-a-half drive back down to Etowah because we heard of 2 coal trains that were intercepting in the yard there. A loaded C449 and an empty E334, respectively. We also heard that these 2 trains were getting their crews to leave Etowah at almost the exact same time, and the 2 trains would leave in opposing directions, so choosing which one to go for would be fairly tricky. But the C449 headed south would get their EC1 to leave the yard first, so that's the one we chose to go for.
Train ID is C44926. Got on duty times 1500 hours. Engineer Ratcliffe, engineer trainee Laney, and conductor Nichols. Got lead engine CSXT 986. TO and PTC are good, no restrictions.
About 5.5 miles south of the yard at Etowah is the overpass of Bowater Road. To gain some adequate distance on C449 to have enough time to set up for him, this is where we chose to go, paired with the fact that road crossings between the yard and here were very limited. And though south of Etowah Yard, so we're technically not on the KD subdivision anymore, the northward shining sun would make for a beautiful scene with the loaded coal train in southern Etowah.
986 out, clear, 341, C449.
From the yard at Etowah South to the connection with the W&A line in Cartersville, Georgia, this line is known as the Etowah Subdivision. And running that subdivision this afternoon is the fairly uncommon C449, a unit train loaded with coal from Corbin, Kentucky, bound for Rincon, Georgia at the Georgia Pacific Savannah River Mill. I'm not exactly sure what the frequency of these Rincon-bound coal trains would be, but judging by other coal trains that I've seen run in this territory with these kinds of coal hoppers, I would guess that it's only about once a month that Rincon will receive one of these trains. And so we're kind of glad that we made the decision to come see the 449 because it's a fairly uncommon train to see, at least from what we know.
DC dispatch call me E33425, over.
E33425.
Alright, sir, what else have you got, over?
About 95 empties, 2185 on tons, 5183 long. That lead motor 3446.
Turns out that, for once in this sport, we make all the right decisions. After having gone for the C449 leaving from Etowah southward, on our way back north to Etowah, E334 gets their permission to leave right as we come back into town. And so without stopping for the yard, we head straight north as E334 is already beginning to crawl out onto the main. And so we knew that tonight, like the M542 from the previous day, this is the train that we'd follow back to Knoxville. The only difference is that we would intentionally be chasing this one. Taking off from Etowah right at 5 p.m., E334 is coal empties returning from Creole, Mississippi, bound for Grafton, West Virginia. Viewed from atop the US 411 overpass, this would mark the beginning of their speedy run for Corbin. And from there, the chase was on. E334 versus us, northbound of US 411. Our next target were the USNS color lights back at Englewood, Tennessee. And we figured it was going to come down to the wire between us and the train at getting there. Though our arrival at Englewood would actually be fairly anticlimactic as we'd arrived to all red signals northbound. Though we knew we were still ahead of the train, so we weren't really sure why they didn't have a signal here yet. At first we had thought that it might have had something to do with the track work that was going on here yesterday when we saw the work train, though it'd quickly become apparent that everything was working just fine. It was just another train that we'd see to the north that was holding everything up. Almost without warning, a headlight would come out of the north signaling a southbound train on the KD sub, one that we thought we didn't know about until we saw what it was. And surprise, it was our old friend M541 from this morning back at LaFollette. They had finished working the yard at Knoxville and were now continuing southbound for their next crew change at Etowah. And after having worked that Knoxville yard brings me to my point earlier that now that we've seen him the second time, he's even shorter than before. And perhaps just as ironic is that the E334 meeting them here would be taking the siding? Now, of course 334 is taking the siding here because it's the only way that they can pass the 541, but after me and Andrew had made countless jokes about how rusty the rails on the Inglewood siding were due to the infrequency of trains over them, we found it pretty wild to see E334, a train, taking that siding and using those rusty rails. I suppose, as we always say, that's how you speak it into existence. Even though the very short 541 cleared the north end switch likely before the 334 cleared the south switch, 334 would still pull up to Inglewood Avenue and stop, even though their medium clear signal had already come up for them to leave the siding and continue north. I actually vaguely remember one of the crew members getting off 334 and heading into the nearby Shell station to pick something up out of there. Now, obviously I couldn't tell you what that thing was, but if I was working for CSX on one of these empty coal trains, I personally wouldn't mind a hot dog rolling north on the KD this evening. But alas, we aren't in that position. We're on the ground with cameras filming this train, which was now on their way north with their medium clear indication their next destination, Corbin, Kentucky. As the majority of you have likely picked up on by now, 334 headed north this evening would have CSX locomotive 3194 in the second position, specially painted to commemorate law enforcement officers on both the railroad and civil extensions. But E334-25, the first train on the Inglewood siding in enough time to have gotten rust forming on the railheads, rejoins with the KD sub at North End Inglewood. And so the northward chase would continue. Surprisingly, we were actually able to get ahead of the train again, stopping off for him one last time just north of the control point of Fagan. And by this time, the crew had gotten the train well up to track speed. I don't believe this crew was any short on time, but it seems as though they were making sure they'd have as much time left over as possible when they got to Corbin. And contrary to what I said earlier back in Etowah, sometimes in this hobby it doesn't matter what decisions you can make all the right ones and still end up in the dumps. What I mean by that is you could have a totally clear US Highway 411 in front of you to get back to Knoxville, but just like that, out of nowhere, you could get stuck in traffic from a traffic accident and be stuck just like that. Such happened to us this evening, and once we were stuck in the non-moving bumper-to-bumper traffic, there was nothing we could do. But even so, we did as much as we could. We got out of the traffic and found an alternate route to Knoxville, but such would slow us down still just enough to miss the train back at Willoughby. We would make it to the Diamond about 8.5 minutes too late. But similar to the previous night, it wouldn't all be a lost cause. A whole nother railroad, Norfolk Southern, also has a line here that crosses the CSX. And the eastbound headlight that would eventually show up out of the west would signify that they had some trains to run across the KD sub. Norfolk Southern would soon provide us with another 2-for-1 here. Without slowing down, a westbound mixed freight comes out of the siding just east of the diamond after our eastbound one cleared. Another combination of manifest freight with some intermodal containers. About 5 miles north of the Willoughby interlocking on CSX is the siding of Amherst, and hearing that the E334 headed north would stop there to meet a southbound ethanol train, we knew that it was only a matter of time until our last train of the night would show up. And we'd only need about 15 more minutes until southbound B709 came across the diamond. Being another fairly uncommon unit train for this territory, B709 is a train of tank cars loaded with ethanol destined for the Eco Energy facility in Lads, Georgia, just outside of Cartersville. It's quite an interesting operation, Andrew has told me, since he lives down that way. The Eco Energy facility in Lads is a stub end terminal, so when the train gets there, it has to be shoved in backwards and broken up. And so, supposedly, when the trains go to leave the facility empty, they have to be pulled out and then shoved backwards all the way into Cartersville, since there aren't any means to get engines from one end to the other or spin the entire train until there. It all sounds quite intriguing, and if I do end up with the opportunity in the future to see that, I probably will document it to some extent or another. But all we'd see of the Lads ethanol train tonight was a run-by through Knoxville. Changing crews one last time when they make it to Etowah, this train would be in Lads by early tomorrow morning. But once he was out of our sights, that was where we would call it a day on the KD Subdivision. We'd head into downtown to Balter Beer Works for dinner before calling it a night and heading back to the hotel. At least, of course, until tomorrow. A bit of an abrupt start to December 29th as the locomotives for L665 jump across the diamond. With 3 locomotives for power, L665 is the Knoxville local switcher. Originating in Knoxville Yard every day, L665 works all of the local customers off the main line around Knoxville, Tennessee. The freight for those customers arrives in Knoxville Yard via M541 or 542, making those pickups or drop-offs. And as for us, yes, we're back at Willoughby because we really didn't have much of a plan for today. Because we really didn't hear about anything running around us besides L665 and one other thing, but that would come later this afternoon. The Norfolk Southern seemed to come and fix things though, as what looked to be an intermodal train showed up out of the west. They would show up and stop just short of the Concord Street crossing. And they would sit there, and sit there, and sit there. We didn't really know why. They sat there for so long that L665 would actually come back south again. Having worked a handful of industries north of Knoxville, including the chemical customer at Dosset, 665 was bringing it all back to the yard, and now with road slug number 2221 leading. There was almost a part of us that thought that perhaps since CSX has priority over this diamond, that the NS train was waiting for this L665 to clear the diamond. But even though 665 had been across it for about 7 minutes afterward, the NS train still had not gotten a signal or moved one bit. Nor would it move for the next 20 minutes, and eventually we'd have to call it quits and head on. Because the one thing that we did hear about, we'd have to get in position for fairly quickly as the day was progressing. So eventually we would call it quits and run for the hills. The hills, you're asking? That would be the most northern part of the KD subdivision in Tennessee, the curvy and mountainous section between LaFollette and the Kentucky border. We'd stop along the way at the siding of Kilsyth. This is mostly the southernmost portion of the mountainous terrain, and some more old signals lie here at the north end of the siding. These are certainly original signals, but the design of them is fairly interesting as they almost look like searchlight signals with one light on each head, though the head designs look almost similar to the modern ones of today. That or the other color light signals that aren't the circular searchlight design. And in addition, an uncommon dwarf signal guards the exit to the siding. We'd stop at Kilsyth for a couple reasons. The signals here were interesting that we knew and we wanted to see them along our way, and this is where Andrew would have to part ways with us. They would have to be back in central Georgia before nightfall, and it was already the early afternoon.
Alright, I think this is where we have to part ways with you, Andrew. Stop playing in the ice and look at me. Do it. This is what happens when we find a frozen lake when it's 50 degrees. Yeah, hardly even did anything. Some solid ice though.
Though now down 2 people, a handful of miles later would bring us to a stop along a lonely mountainside road, the sparsely crowded State Road 9. And seemingly out of nowhere, clinging to the side of a mountain, a 12,000-foot-long bomb snakes its way out of Kentucky and into the gradients of northern Tennessee. Entering the Tennessean mountains from our north would be a southbound ethanol unit train B637, Chicago, Illinois to Lawrenceville, Georgia. Over 12,000 feet of explosive material that this crew and one other have been assigned to get over this mountain today. That said, it would not be a quick process, so chasing this train would be pretty easy even on this mountainous curvy road. Around about a dozen corners and we'd find a more sketchy mountain road that would lead to a pretty cool spot, the control point of Oaks. Here are some more original yet interestingly designed signals for the crossover in the middle of the double track that starts about 2 miles to our north at control point Chaska and ends at control point Habersham about a mile to our south. We would actually have a bit more time to get ready than I thought we would because I forgot about the fact that the train would have to make a stop in the ghost town of Morley, Tennessee. We will see why when the train passes us here. Which would occur fairly shortly, as after the stop was made, they'd be back on the move fairly quickly, though they'd still have to take it fairly easy because 12,000 feet of explosives are still being towed in the rear. 1,206 feet above sea level, 6 total locomotives are working very hard to keep this 12,000-foot train moving. Through the Appalachian Mountains, this train weighs well over 20,000 tons, and these 2 to 3% grades are not forgiving to that weight. Locomotives 1 to 3 would be at the head. Locomotives 4 and 5 would be midway about 6,000 feet into the train. 2 Canadian National locomotives that would make their way through the interchange up at Chicago. The explanation behind these 2 mid-train distributed locomotives is that this 12,000-foot unit train would be divided by them at its halfway point 6,000 feet in, as a result of this being 2 ethanol trains combined. One ethanol train, B639 from the Canadian Pacific Railway, and a second ethanol train, B637 from the Canadian National Railway, would both be on their way towards Lawrenceville at approximately the same general time. As a result, the decision was made to combine the 2 trains together at Granite, Indiana, so that on their way to Lawrenceville they could both be on the same movement so they wouldn't have to move in separate increments. Though the 2 trains would have to be separated at either Etowah, Tennessee or Atlanta, Georgia, because the facility in Lawrenceville can only hold one of these trains at a time. But it would also result in this 12,000-foot long monster creeping through the Appalachians this afternoon. As a result of literally shoving the B637 train onto the back of the B639, the 2 Canadian National engines with the second train then became mid-train locomotives. And the 6th locomotive that would be placed at the rear would have nothing to do with these ethanol trains whatsoever. This would actually be the Morley Pusher, such as it's referred to by rail fans. Similar to Norfolk Southern's practice in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, this train made that stop in Morley, Tennessee, just to our north, to add this pusher locomotive to the end of the train. It's separately manned, and the second crew is operating that locomotive in coordinates with the head-end crew to keep this train moving. Because from Morley around the corners to Kilsyth is the most unforgiving part of this terrain. The 2 Canadian National locomotives in the middle are not separately manned and are being operated remotely from the head end. Winding through and through further on the mountainside State Road 9 until we reach the B&B Market. Situated right alongside the Mountainside Road in Duff, Tennessee, right in the middle of Kilsyth siding, the B&B Market, while closed today, is frankly a classic shack. Established 1941, a member of the NFIB, they have a sign right outside that says, "Smile, you're on camera." And to that, I say you are too.
Where did I put you at back there, Luke? We're probably about 10 cars north of the state. Yeah, it ain't terrible.
Taking the second spot on my camera would be the southbound B637, southbound ethanol loads for Lawrenceville, Georgia, being pulled and pushed through these mountains by 6 consecutive engines. The terrain that is visible in the background of this shot is a testament to what this train and its crews have had to battle for the past hour and a half. Though their southward roll, while not being all that hasty to begin with, would slow down even more so into Duff, because this is about where they would stop to offload the Morley Pusher. Now that they've reached this point, the hardest part of their mountain trek is over, and so they no longer need that 6th locomotive at the rear of the train. The second crew would be able to take the locomotive off and run it back north to Morley. There, they would await their next assignment, and with not many trains running on the KD subdivision, they might be there a while.
You got communication over here? Hey, fellas, y'all have to... Yeah, sure see me too back there. I sure appreciate y'all. I really go fast and everything. Yeah, I appreciate the help. Y'all fellas behave yourselves. Alright.
But we would not be heading back north with the Morley Pusher, we'd be heading south towards Knoxville with B637. So, taking advantage of the 12,000 foot long train's momentary stop, we'd take the opportunity to get back ahead of the train and stop off at Jordan Hollow. Here, about 4 track miles north of downtown LaFollette, the Allis Creek runs beneath the Katy subdivision, such that also parallels Ivydale Road. Even though the irregular State Road 9's traffic was still running past us about 100 feet to our east, the small creek running beneath the tracks over the miscellaneous pebbles and small amounts of ice left over from the previous day's freeze made for a very relaxing wait. This would ultimately make for one of those winter scenes that I long for the rest of the year. And the beautiful 50-degree temperatures in the setting sun would only make it all the more enjoyable. Some ATV fans would also take advantage of this weather, actually running through the creek bed as we waited on the train. Which is what would ultimately break the temporary silence. It was all downhill from here, and those 20,000 tons would make that run very easy. And so out of the mountains came B637. Knowing that we'd have a stretch of downtown intersections ahead of us, we would not wait for the end of the train. We'd have to get back on State Road 9 to get through downtown LaFollette quickly if we wanted any chance of getting ahead of this train again. Though the train would ultimately slow through downtown LaFollette, our slowdowns would make it so we were still parallel with the train as we came through downtown's parallels. A CSX defect detector would confirm the train's smooth running as we came through town.
Detector, milepost 224.0, no defects. Repeat, no defects. Detector out.
And now exiting LaFollette, ultimately fighting to keep up with the train through Jacksboro and Caryville. If you recall from yesterday, this is the part where the Katy subdivision diverges away from I-75, diverging off the main path at Rocky Top and making a southwesterly beeline towards Oak Ridge. That is also much of the reason we didn't wait for the rest of the train back at Allis Creek. I'd want to make sure that I had a fairly good head start on that southwesterly path. And I would not regret that decision because that would ultimately allow us to refuel and find our next stopping location, such that I decided would be the north end of Granite siding. One of my main reasons for visiting the Katy subdivision this year is its originally installed searchlight signals, but many places along the Katy subdivision at which these signals are located are not very accessible, at least not legally. But the north end of Granite, which is only about 8 track miles north of Dosset that we visited yesterday, was publicly accessible off some neighborhood back streets. And to my surprise, when we arrived, there would be a northbound train already sitting in the siding. Now, frankly, I had no idea what this train was, and I hadn't heard anything about it, so it had frankly come out of nowhere. But hardly could I consider the situation or what train was sitting here for very long, because B637 was not waiting on me to figure this out. Within a few minutes of arriving, I'd have to hit record, because this train was coming up on Granite fast. Like I've said, whatever train is sitting in the siding just south of us here is a total mystery to me because I've heard nothing of its whereabouts up until this point now. But considering the facts that this train is heading north, the first cars that I can see are CSX-owned hoppers, and the fact that the train is sitting in a siding that's only about 5,900 feet long led me to believe that this was an empty coal train of some iteration or another. which would make for a quite interesting meet between two unit trains at sunset. A meet that would be guarded by 3 pairs of searchlight signals.
Clear south, Granite, B637, 22, CSX engine 3093 south.
These 3 searchlight signal masts that guard the north end switch here are likely originally installed, but the electricity, perhaps of the same heritage, I suppose just doesn't age. Because such that would carry the dispatcher's command to line the north end of Granite switch to the siding would be carried out immediately. Such that would turn the signal from the siding to the main green. And our confirmed empty coal train would take off out of the sunset with plenty of power. Two GE AC4400 CW locomotives originally purchased for this exact kind of service, pulling an empty string of CSX company coal hoppers. As the train rolled out past me here, I still had no idea what it was, but later on in the night I'd find out through the KD Sub Facebook group that this was an E738, empty coal hoppers returning for Newell, Pennsylvania from Baltimore, Maryland. And I also believe that, similar to the C449 from yesterday at Etowah, that these trains with the company coal hoppers don't run this line all that often, so to see it here at Granite this evening with its classic 1990s power was even more of a treat. And even though the E738 was on the northward roll again within the minute that B637 cleared this north switch, B637 was still rolling quickly down their southwesterly path. By roughly the time that the empty coal train cleared us at the north switch here, the 637 was already rolling through Dorset, 8 miles away. Though, if we started now, we could still stay ahead of the train because they would still then have to make the southeasterly path back to Knoxville. So, where do you think in Knoxville we're gonna choose to go? Come on, the tried and true Willoughby. Such is what I would call it as we rolled into town tonight, with roughly 15 minutes to spare before B637 rolled south across the Norfolk Southern's West End district.
Clear with B637.2, CSX engine 3093 south.
Good day and good night. B637 was the only train that we had heard about running this day, and the E738 that we ended up seeing along the way was a surprise. And so sure, it was only about 8 o'clock in the evening by now, but there was frankly nothing else running. And so after the successful chase through the Appalachian Mountains, this is where we would conclude the day number 4. Of course, only until tomorrow. Good day and good morning. Now December 30th, we've set up at Amherst, Tennessee. And just as a quick disclaimer, this will be the least busy day of this trip. There would be hardly much of anything running today. The daily M542 had already made it through this area before the sun had come up, and the southbound M541 counterpart would not make it to this area until well after dark tonight. So that would leave us today with very limited options. The potential of some Norfolk Southern action back down at Willoughby, the potential of a unit train to show up on CSX out of nowhere, and the L665, which is frankly the only reason that we're even out trackside right now. I had heard via the radio that 665 was working customers on the KD north of Knoxville, and that he would be returning to Knoxville fairly soon. So since I hadn't shot a train yet at Amherst siding, I figured that we could go there because there were some more searchlight signals that were at least visible. The north and south switches to Amherst siding are not directly accessible, but via this telephoto shot, you can see the south end of Amherst signals as 665 rounds the corner headed south towards Knoxville. A pretty short consist heading back south of mostly scrap gons and tank cars. Unit trains on the KD sub were always a possibility, but we had not heard of any running in the area, so we figured that wouldn't be one. So that would leave us with one final option, Norfolk Southern action back down at the Willoughby interlocking. So that's where we'd head back to after Amherst, and since 665 would actually stop to work another customer before Knoxville, we'd be able to beat them back down to the interlocking where we'd see them cross and make for our technically first train there of today. We've already seen the 665 cross this diamond a couple times, but of interest on their consist today was this scrap gon with a very warped bottom. Considering that the primary method of loading these scrap gons is in and out from the top of the car, it baffles me as to how the bottom would have gotten warped upwards so badly. But the car still rolls and hasn't been set out as a bad order, so I guess there isn't much else wrong with it. 665 would be pulling it all back to the yard at Knoxville anyhow, after which they'd shut their engines down as their work for this morning was complete. That would pretty much leave us stranded at Willoughby for pretty much all the time after that until Norfolk Southern decided to bring a train to us out of the west. Another general mixed commodity freight train. Now, the day was progressing fairly quickly by this point, and this Norfolk Southern train we just saw was literally pure luck. Had this one not shown up, we probably wouldn't have seen anything else today. Because still, the radio was practically silent and we had heard about nothing else moving. So that is when we decided to head off and go do some exploring. There are a few other notable things to be seen on the KD sub, so I figured that we could spend this time to go and check those out. It was about this time that I realized while trying to explore the locations where some of the searchlight signals are located that they are hardly accessible in most places. Eventually, we'd find ourselves back on Edgemore Road, which would eventually take us over to the Tennessee Valley Authority's Bull Run fossil plant, thereby under the same ownership as the Kingston plant on Norfolk Southern's C&O and TP line. The CSX KD sub runs right to the plant's west, and occasionally the fossil plant will get a coal train via the KD. In regards to the KD sub here, there's a double track that breaks out of the single main just north of the plant below Edgemore Road. 3 searchlight signals guard the switch, and the control point is named Edgemore. The double track continues for 3 miles to the north before singling back up at the control point of Clinch River. Now, just south of Edgemore Road, we have another absolute signal named Bull Run for the fossil plant that resides next door. Now, just south of this signal, we have a switch that breaks out of the main line and enters the loop track of the TVA plant. This is where the coal trains will exit the KD sub and enter the loop track to unload at the fossil plant. The Bull Run facility is located right off the banks of the Bull Run Creek, about 6 track miles south of Dosset, and interestingly is the only single generator coal-fired power plant on TVA's system. When the plant began operations in 1967, it was the largest in the world in the volume of steam produced. The plant has a summer net capability of 865 megawatts and generates approximately 6 billion kilowatt hours of electricity a year, enough to supply 400,000 homes according to the Tennessee Valley Authority's webpage. Though such will only be a statistic for so long, as reviewing public input on February 14th of 2019, the TVA Board of Directors approved the retirement of this Bull Run facility by December of 2023. Apparently, the plant is no longer needed, and TVA's other plants such as Kingston will likely pick up the slack. All that said, why aren't we focused on trying to see a coal train to this TVA plant while we're up here this year? And my answer to that is, especially since we had heard about this news while we were up here, is that we were focused on seeing one of those trains fairly sharply. There were just simply no trains en route to the plant while we were up here, and chances are, as the shutdown time gets closer and closer, trains will be on an even less frequent basis to the plant. And such as to also be considered that we only had 6 days to spend trackside up here. Though armed with all this information, I do want to come back up to this area of Tennessee perhaps this summer when I have more time to spend by the tracks and try to get one of these trains arriving at the plant before it closes for good. Because going off the time that I shot these videos, I'd have 12 months to make it happen. But such news would not make a change to today's circumstances, such which would not have any trains running on the KD at all. And we would realize all this fairly quickly, so with an invitation from distant family to have a late afternoon lunch in Knoxville, we'd call it a day trackside just shy of 2 p.m. Such is a decision that we'd make so that we could have as early a start as possible on tomorrow, our very last day. And so on the sidelines of a power plant that has its months ticking down, this is where we would call it quits for day number 5. Piney Grove Church Road, 6:20 a.m. The sun has yet to rise on our final day in central Tennessee. One final cluster of trains over the KD subdivision would finalize our trip. The first one, which can be seen right here, idling between tree lines under only the lights of its number boards, was southbound M541, the daily manifest freight train from Cincinnati, Ohio to Waycross, Georgia. The Piney Grove Church Road crossing at which we're stationed is right in the middle of the siding of Amherst, and it became evident to me fairly quickly that where this train was sitting was not fully within the siding, so the bottom end of this train was still hanging out past the north end switch. So what was this train doing here if they weren't fully in the siding and out of the way of other movements? Well, they actually weren't even tied down. They still had a crew sitting up in that cab, but they'd been there since 2:30 this morning. If it wasn't for a lack of a train crew and a number of miscalculations at Knoxville, we would have missed this train and the others completely. The reason that M541 has been held out here for the last 4.5 hours is because the northbound M542, this train's counterpart bound for Cincinnati from Waycross, was working Knoxville Yard. Well, actually they weren't yet. The last crew had gone on the law at Knoxville at about midnight last night, and the new crew had not yet shown up yet. They would show up at around 7 a.m. and start working the yard once they got on the train, but since the yard at Knoxville is as small as it is, M541, who also has to work the yard, could not run to Knoxville until 542 got out.
541, come in.
Yeah, we're looking at our time here. We've only got about 3 hours left to see if they got a plan, maybe.
Yeah, this 542 is still crashing around here at Knoxville, but there's reefer calls. The plan was to get it to Knoxville.
So they'd have no choice but to sit here at Amherst until the 542 got past them northbound. And as a result, a third train coming south would be held up behind the 541 up at Edgemore. So another couple of hours would pass, the sun would finally rise, and M542 eventually would get their stuff sorted out in Knoxville with a new crew on board and get permission to depart northbound for Corbin and ultimately Cincinnati.
We are done. I'm waiting for my conductor to get up here to the head end, and then we can depart from right here where I'm at, if that's okay with you. You get the information there? Let me look at the sheet here. Let's see here. Permission to depart from where you stand.
It was an agonizing morning for just about everybody, including the new 542 crew. The work at Knoxville had reportedly not exactly gone as smoothly as it should have. Hence then, it's 8 o'clock in the morning now, and they're finally getting past Amherst with 541 waiting. So with the news that 542 was finally out of Knoxville and headed their way, 541 would kick their engines back on and start running towards the south end. Like I said before, the position at which 541 had come to a stop here at about 2 a.m. had left about half their train hanging out of the north end. They had done this because if they had pulled to the south end, they'd have been blocking this Piney Church road crossing for the now 5.5 hours that they had been sitting here. So now, at almost 8:30 a.m., 541 would rumble back to life.
About 9,200 feet long, we had to pick up on the bottom. Yeah, we heard all of it, man. CSX. Great day, buddy. Sorry about all the delay. It's okay. We need to vent about CSX. Let's give it plenty of time. Right, bud. Southwest of Amherst. Northbound direction on M542. CSX 502 out.
With 541 now creeping towards the south end of Amherst, the bottom of their train is now clear of the north end switch, so 542 can pass them on track 2, the main line.
Amherst at 14, it's raining. Not dead sure how fast it's going to go up the mountain.
Yeah, I mean, hey, before we left Etowah, I explained all this, talked to them about it. I mean, it is what it is. Yes, sir. Sure it is. What do we know, right? Sucker up.
We had to pick up 29 cars on 4 separate tracks.
The 7400 length rule doesn't apply to the head-in engine.
Freight rules that nobody knows about it.
Yeah, because we left Etowah at 7,600 feet. They signed off on it to just go to Knoxville, but they didn't tell us that. Then we got up here and we had to swap everything, which are pickup. Yeah, I think I'll sit over here and wait on y'all. Anybody will learn from this experience. Well, this was all, from my understanding, it was all decided from a out-of-town MTO that was taken over for Dawn.
All good, hanging.
Appreciate it. I was still looking at you here.
I appreciate it. That's one of them weed lights. We have to go find that thing in the weeds between 7 track and 1. Man, you must have some good eyes. Yeah, I found it in the bushes. Next to each other. I figured we got a 50-50 chance of one of them working. Hot water roll one. Heck yeah. Smoke in the new year, baby. 420.
CSX 3213 south in 54138.
With the 2-train clog finally out of the system, we would be able to move northward for the 3rd train coming south that would finally be able to make its way south after 542 got past them sitting at Edgemoor. For this final southbound, I would utilize a spot that I had been looking at all trip but hadn't had the chance to use until now. And I knew that with this likely to be our final train on the KD sub, this would be my final chance to use this location. And so we would waste no time, as it was only a matter of time until that final southbound got their move on. So we would wind back and forth through some more back streets until the road crossing of Coward Mill Road. Situated about 8 track miles south of Edgemoor, the Coward Mill crossing runs parallel with the Beaver Creek, and as a result a small rail bridge sits in the foreground. The track also curves off into the hilly terrain about 300 feet north of the pavement, and the fog that would be set over the scene this morning would make it all that much more unique as we would get in position for our southbound ethanol train.
This day south, clear for speed. 6:30 on out, and a happy new year.
An automatic block signal stands just south of the road crossing, staying dark until a train is practically right on top of it. So when it finally went green, it was go time. Southbound unit train B631, ethanol loads from Chicago, Illinois for Tampa, Florida, would be coming over the KD subdivision this early morning. And it would have been even earlier morning had the 541 and 2 holdup not happened. But even with the sun now above the horizon, the fog is still in place, making for a unique, eerie feel as our ethanol train came south with some foreign power. Now, finally, on the final day, a train that I'm familiar with from my home territory. B631 off the Canadian Pacific Railway interchange at Chicago, routed south via Garrett, Indiana, Deschler, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Corbin, Kentucky, Knoxville, Tennessee, Etowah, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Fitzgerald, Georgia, Waycross, Georgia, Folkston, Georgia, and ultimately onto my home rails through Baldwin, Florida, Bushnell, Dade City, Vitus, Plant City, and into Tampa, Florida, where the train will be unloaded at the Hookers Point gasoline terminal in the port of Tampa. With this 6,000 feet of ethanol now descending from the Appalachian Mountains, they're still grinding into the miscellaneous hills surrounding Knoxville with their 2 head-end motors and their 1 on the rear. After the morning's delays, 631's crew was finally able to crank the engines back up, but only for another handful of miles. Like 541 before them, they too would have to stop at Amherst. Now that 542 was out of the way and 541 had made it to Knoxville, they had to work Knoxville, but they couldn't fit in Knoxville. So, similar to the 541 of our second day trackside at Willoughby, they would also be hanging out of the north end of the yard. And they'd have to let 541 get their yard work done, because as they said this morning, 541's crew only had a few hours left in their shift, and so they were going to use all of that time to get their work done at Knoxville. At which point, because of the train's length, they would have to tie part of the train down on the main line and part of the train down in the yard. And all of this morning's mishaps would also throw a wrench in our plans, because like 541's crew, we too were also now running short on time, because our flight for home left McGee-Tyson Airport in a handful of hours and we still had to get our stuff from the hotel room. But hearing the railroad's plans, we would spend the time while 541 worked Knoxville to run back to the hotel and get our stuff to go home. So now packed up and checked out, ready to leave, we could spend the remainder of our time waiting on B631 south of Knoxville. We would spend that remainder of time in the Scottish Pike River Park on the southern banks of the Tennessee River. B631 would be able to continue southward after 541 finished their work at Knoxville Yard, and so we'd stake it out here at this impressive trestle, as this would be our final train and shot of the trip. One final searchlight signal guards the southern end of Knoxville Yard as 631 emerges from the yard, diverging off of one of the yard tracks. 631 got ran through one of the Knoxville Yard tracks today because, like I said earlier, 541's train was partially tied down on the main, so they had to run it through the yard partially. Though that did buy us some more time and gave us an ample look at the foreign locomotive leading B631 as our final train of the trip crested the Tennessee River.
Here off. B631 out and a Happy New Year. Alright. Y'all have a good one, you know.
A 5,000-foot-long string of shiny tank cars loaded with ethanol crossed the Tennessee River just after 10 a.m. And it would be here, overlooking the bustling city of Knoxville, Tennessee, that we would come to terms with the trip, realizing that now it was at its end. Although those terms in question were highly favorable ones. I had a great time on this trip. It was almost near perfect. Having snow fall on the ground the first day trackside, finding many of the scenic areas that I had hoped for on this trip, and then seeing a plethora of trains that had their own unique stories to tell, made for one of my most favorite trips so far. And add to all that even though they had to leave a couple days prematurely to us, Andrew and his family members were able to make it up here and railfan alongside me on the KD Sub for a few days. And since I'm not able to see Andrew as often as we'd like to, it really makes me happy to know that this trip went down in both of our books as a very enjoyable favorite. Simply put, this was a near perfect Christmas, and a great way to end and spend the Christmas of 2022. And how ironic it is that the southern banks of the Tennessee River that began my C&O and TP trip just 5 months prior would now end my KD Subdivision trip 5 months later. And even though it's taken me almost 4 months to put this video together, I'm happy that I was able to make a video about this trip and finally get it online. And to the viewers, especially those of you that may still be here after an hour and a half, my thanks all go to you as well. And so off goes B631, Tampa's ethanol train bound for Florida, and so we'd head off shortly after, also bound for Florida via Atlanta and Sarasota. Thanks again for taking an interest in my take on CSX's KD Subdivision between Corbin, Kentucky and Etowah, Tennessee. And so in Knoxville, Tennessee, on the southern banks of the Tennessee River, and whenever I'll see y'all next on the Sunshine State Rails, this is Kotabeaner out, and everybody have a happy new year.
Pertain south. Here, Buckfest. Bay 631 out. And everybody have a happy new year.